In 1939, in a locked laboratory in San Diego, California, a microscope captured something impossible. The lens focused on a virus, but what appeared was not the fuzzy blob standard microscopes revealed. Instead, a pulsing, oscillating form emerged, alive with frequency and light. The man operating the device had spent 14 years perfecting this instrument. Within 5 years, every trace of his work would vanish. This was not an isolated incident. Across the 20th century, inventors developed devices that claimed to perceive what human senses could not detect. These machines promised to reveal hidden energy fields, electromagnetic frequencies beyond known spectra, and dimensions existing parallel to our own. The pattern that followed was consistent. Initial demonstrations drew crowds and funding. Then came official scrutiny. Finally, systematic erasure. What connects a Soviet photography technique, an American microscope, and a series of energy detection devices spanning 5 decades? The same sequence of events, promising results, growing interest. Then confiscation, mysterious fires, and silenced inventors. The technologies varied wildly in their claimed mechanisms. Some detected supposed energy fields around living organisms. Others measured frequencies that standard instruments could not register. A few purported to visualize internal body structures from a distance without X-rays or physical contact. What they shared was a threat to established scientific paradigms, and what followed was a pattern of suppression so methodical it suggests coordination rather than coincidence. The first device emerged from the Soviet Union in 1939, the same year the San Diego microscope achieved its impossible magnification. Semyon Kirlian, an electrical technician in Krasnodar, was repairing hospital equipment when a spark jumped from a high-frequency electrical device to his hand. The flash of light left an unusual mark. But more intriguing was what Kirlian claimed to see in that moment, a corona of light surrounding his hand that seemed independent of the electrical discharge itself. Kirlian spent the next decade developing a photographic process to capture this phenomenon. His technique involved placing an object on photographic film and subjecting it to a high-voltage, high-frequency electrical field. The resulting images showed radiant halos around living objects' hands, leaves, even insects that appeared far more vivid than those around inanimate objects. Kirlian claimed these coronas represented a biological energy field, something that standard photography could never capture. The Soviet government initially supported the research. By 1949, Kirlian and his wife Valentina had documented thousands of these photographs. They observed that diseased leaves showed diminished coronas compared to healthy ones. A freshly cut leaf displayed a brilliant discharge pattern that faded over hours. Most peculiarly, they documented what became known as the phantom leaf effect. A removed portion of a leaf still appeared to produce a faint corona where it once existed. Western scientists learned of Kirlian photography in the 1960s when Soviet journals published selected findings. The technique sparked immediate interest. American and European researchers began replicating the experiments. Initial results seemed to confirm the Soviet claims. Variations in the corona patterns appeared to correlate with emotional states in humans and stress levels in plants, but the scientific establishment pushed back hard. Critics argued that the coronas were simply moisture and ionization effects, predictable results of electrical discharge with no mysterious energy involved. When enthusiasts claimed the photographs proved the existence of auras or life force energy, mainstream science largely dismissed the entire field as pseudoscience. Research funding dried up. Academic papers on Kirlian photography became career liabilities. By the 1980s, most serious investigation had ceased. The equipment remained simple enough for hobbyists to build, but scientific study effectively ended. Kirlian died in 1980, his work relegated to the fringes, yet the fundamental question remained unanswered. If the coronas were merely moisture and ionization, why did they vary so consistently with biological states? And why did a phantom effect appear where tissue had been removed? The suppression pattern became clearer with Royal Raymond Rife, the San Diego inventor whose microscope opened this investigation. Rife was not a marginal figure. By 1920, he had already received government commissions for optical research. His microscope, which he called the universal microscope, employed principles that conventional optics considered impossible. Standard microscopes of the 1930s could magnify objects roughly 2,000 times. Rife claimed his instrument achieved magnifications of 60,000 times while maintaining clarity. The device used heterodyning light frequencies combining different wavelengths to produce intermediate frequencies that Rife argued could illuminate objects too small for visible light alone to reveal. He illuminated specimens with coordinated light frequencies rather than standard illumination. In 1931, Rife demonstrated the microscope to a group that included representatives from Johns Hopkins and Northwestern University. The observers reported seeing living organisms at magnifications they had never witnessed before. Rife claimed to observe the organisms he called BX viruses, which he believed caused cancer. More controversially, he said he could destroy these organisms by exposing them to specific frequencies that resonated with their structural oscillation rates. The medical implications were staggering. If cancer resulted from a virus, and if that virus could be destroyed with frequency alone, no surgery, no radiation, no chemical toxins, the entire oncology field would transform. Rife's associates began treating patients with his Rife frequency generator, reporting remarkable recovery rates. One physician, Dr. Milbank Johnson, documented cases where tumors appeared to dissolve after frequency exposure. Then the attacks began. The American Medical Association, led by Morris Fishbein, launched an investigation. When Rife refused to partner with Fishbein's pharmaceutical interests, the tone shifted from inquiry to persecution. Doctors who worked with Rife received threatening letters. Dr. Johnson died under mysterious circumstances in 1944. The night before he was scheduled to announce the results of a major clinical study, his papers vanished. By 1939, photographs of the universal microscope had been published in scientific journals. But when researchers tried to examine the actual device, obstacles emerged. Rife's lab was broken into multiple times. Equipment was stolen or vandalized. Legal challenges drained his resources. In 1950, all records of his clinical trials were removed from the archives of the Smithsonian Institution and the Franklin Institute. The most damning event occurred in 1960. A fire destroyed Rife's laboratory and most of his 50 years of research. The official cause was listed as electrical malfunction, but witnesses reported seeing the fire start in 3 separate locations simultaneously. Rife's remaining microscopes were confiscated and disappeared into private collections. He died in 1971, impoverished and largely forgotten. Modern researchers who attempt to replicate Rife's frequency treatments face immediate opposition. Medical boards threaten licenses. Equipment manufacturers refuse to sell components for frequency generators once they learn the intended use. The pattern suggests that whatever Rife discovered, whether truly revolutionary or merely promising, enough to threaten existing interest, remains dangerous to investigate 7 decades later. The third device operated on principles even more controversial than unusual microscopy. In 1940, Wilhelm Reich, an Austrian psychoanalyst who had fled Nazi Germany, began building boxes that he claimed could accumulate a universal energy he called orgone. The construction was deceptively simple, alternating layers of organic material, usually wood or cotton, and metal, typically steel wool, enclosed in a box large enough for a person to sit inside. Reich's theory proposed that orgone energy permeated all space, but that it could be concentrated by certain material combinations. Organic substances absorbed the energy, while metal reflected it. By alternating these layers, Reich believed the device would draw orgone from the environment and concentrate it in the box's interior. A person sitting inside would theoretically receive a concentrated dose of this energy, which Reich claimed could heal illness and restore vitality. The medical establishment viewed this with immediate suspicion, but Reich was not operating in obscurity. He had been a respected psychoanalyst, a student of Freud, and had published extensively on psychosomatic illness. His transition to orgone research struck colleagues as a descent into pseudoscience, but Reich accumulated evidence he found compelling. He documented temperature differences between the interior and exterior of the accumulators. He observed unusual visual phenomena through tubes he constructed to concentrate orgone. He claimed that orgone had a distinctive blue-gray color when concentrated, visible to the adapted eye. Most controversially, he began treating cancer patients with orgone therapy, REPORTING, tumor regressions that conventional medicine could not explain. The United States Food and Drug Administration took notice in 1947. Their investigation concluded that orgone did not exist and that Reich's claims constituted medical fraud. Reich refused to appear in court, stating that scientific matters could not be settled by legal proceedings. The judge ruled against him. In 1956, FDA agents arrived at Reich's laboratory with an injunction. The order was specific and devastating. All orgone accumulators were to be destroyed. All books mentioning orgone were to be burned. Reich watched as decades of research went up in flames. 6 tons of his publications were incinerated in a New York City incinerator. Even books that only mentioned orgone in passing were destroyed. It was the largest book burning in American history since the founding of the Republic. Reich was imprisoned for contempt of court when he continued his research. He died in federal prison in 1957, 1 week before his scheduled parole hearing. The official cause was heart failure, but supporters noted he had been healthy at his last medical examination 2 weeks prior. His remaining research notes vanished from the archive where they had been stored. The pattern intensifies. If orgone was simply a delusion, why the extreme response? Why burn books? Why not simply debunk the claims through scientific testing and public education? The level of suppression suggested that Reich's work threatened something more substantial than medical protocol. The fourth inventor approached the problem from radio theory rather than optics or energy accumulation. Thomas Galen, Hieronymus, an electrical engineer from Kansas City, filed a patent in 1949 for a device he called the eloptic medical analyzer. The patent described an instrument that could detect and measure what Hieronymus termed eloptic energy, a radiation that combined properties of both electricity and light but behaved according to neither known electromagnetic laws. The device resembled a radio receiver, but with crucial differences. A sample of material blood, hair, or even a photograph of a person was placed in the input well. A series of tuning dials allowed the operator to scan through theoretical frequency ranges. When the dial reached a resonant frequency specific to that sample, Hieronymus claimed, a tactile sensation could be felt by stroking a detector plate covered with optical quality plastic. The mechanism defied conventional physics. How could a photograph of a person, which had no physical connection to that person, provide information about their current health status? Hieronymus argued that eloptic radiation carried an informational signature of living organisms, and that this signature remained connected to physical representations, like photographs or biological samples, through a mechanism science had not yet identified. The scientific community dismissed the claims as impossible, yet the United States Patent Office granted patent No. 2,482,773 in 1949 after their examiner built and tested a prototype. The examiner reported obtaining the results Hieronymus described. This was extraordinary. The Patent Office rarely granted patents for devices that violated known physical laws. Yet here was official acknowledgement that the device performed as claimed. Hieronymus spent decades refining the instrument, creating versions that claimed to analyze soil minerals, detect crop diseases, and diagnose human ailments from a distance. Agricultural companies showed interest. Preliminary tests suggested the device could identify mineral deficiencies in soil samples hours faster than chemical analysis. If the technique was valid, it would revolutionize agricultural diagnostics. Then the research simply stopped appearing in journals. Companies that had shown interest ceased communication. Hieronymus continued working until his death in 1988, but academic institutions refused to test his devices. When electronics magazines published articles about the mechanism in the 1970s, subsequent issues printed harsh rebuttals dismissing the entire concept as fraud. The most peculiar aspect was the tactile detection method. Hieronymus insisted the device only worked when a human operator stroked the detector plate. Blind trials produced inconsistent results, leading skeptics to conclude the effect was purely psychological. The operator was unconsciously creating the sensation. Yet operators reported distinct differences in the stick sensation between samples they could not see or identify. How could a psychological effect differentiate between soil samples of varying mineral content when the operator had no knowledge of which sample was being tested? Modern attempts to replicate Hieronymus's work encountered the same obstacles Rife's researchers face. Equipment suppliers become uncooperative once they understand the intended application. University laboratories refuse to allocate time or equipment for testing. The few researchers who persist quickly learn that publishing results, whether positive or negative, marks them as fringe scientists, damaging future career prospects. The fifth device emerged from chiropractic medicine, a field already viewed with suspicion by conventional medical practice. Ruth Drown, a chiropractor practicing in Los Angeles in the 1930s, developed an instrument she called the radiovision apparatus. The device claimed to accomplish something impossible: photographing internal organs and diagnosing disease from a distance, using only a blood sample or signature from the patient. Drown's theory built on earlier work by Albert Abrams, who had proposed that diseased tissue emitted characteristic radio frequencies. She extended this concept, arguing that if disease radiated a signal, that signal could be detected, amplified, and photographed. Her photographs appeared to show spines, organs, and tumors with detail that shocked observers. No X-ray machine was involved. The patient was often hundreds of miles away when the photograph was taken. The mechanism seemed to violate every principle of physics. How could a blood sample collected weeks earlier provide real-time information about a person's current health? Drown explained it through the concept of biological radio broadcasting, that living organisms transmitted information on frequencies that conventional radio equipment could not detect, but that her specially tuned apparatus could receive. Drown demonstrated the device to medical groups. Some doctors reported that the photographs accurately revealed conditions they confirmed through surgery or autopsy. Others dismissed the images as artifacts or frauds, but the photographs were physical objects developed from actual film exposed in the device. Whether they showed genuine internal anatomy or elaborate hoaxes remained hotly debated. The American Medical Association investigated Drown in 1935. They concluded her device was fraudulent and campaigned to have her prosecuted. Medical boards in several states revoked the licenses of doctors who used her equipment. By 1940, using or promoting the radiovision apparatus could end a medical career. Drown continued operating, treating patients who traveled to her clinic despite the official condemnation. In 1951, federal agents raided her office and seized her equipment. The charges were medical fraud and false advertising. Drown was convicted and sentenced to pay substantial fines. She died in 1965, her reputation destroyed, her devices lost to government warehouses or destroyed. What the prosecution never adequately explained was the mechanism by which Drown supposedly created fraudulent photographs. If the images were fabricated, how did she produce them? Standard photographic fakery techniques of the era could not account for the detail in her images. Superimposing X-rays would have been obvious to experts who examined the films. The alternative, that some unknown physical process actually produced the images, was too threatening to established medical and physical science to investigate seriously. The sixth inventor worked with frequencies, but from the perspective of cellular biology rather than radio theory. Georges Lakhovsky, a Russian-born engineer working in Paris in the 1920s, proposed that living cells were essentially tiny radio receivers and transmitters. He argued that health resulted from oscillatory equilibrium cells vibrating at their natural frequencies, while disease occurred when these oscillations became disrupted or dampened. Lakhovsky's theoretical framework suggested that exposing organisms to a broad spectrum of high-frequency electromagnetic waves would allow cells to absorb whatever frequencies they needed to restore their natural oscillation. This was fundamentally different from attempting to kill pathogens with specific frequencies. Instead, it aimed to strengthen the organism's own resonant systems, allowing it to naturally resist disease. He built devices to test this hypothesis. His early work involved treating plants with coils that generated electromagnetic fields. Lakhovsky reported that plants exposed to the fields showed enhanced growth and resistance to disease compared to control specimens. When he inoculated plants with cancer-causing bacteria, those wearing his electromagnetic coils developed smaller tumors or none at all. The results attracted attention from the French Academy of Sciences. By 1931, Lakhovsky had developed a device for human treatment called the multiple wave oscillator. The machine generated a wide spectrum of frequencies, simultaneously, hence multiple wave, allowing each cell to theoretically select and absorb its needed frequency. Patients sat between two large antenna arrays while the device operated. European doctors reported remarkable results. Cancers went into remission. Chronic pain conditions improved. One physician documented treating fibroid tumors that disappeared after several weeks of exposure. Another reported success with inflammatory arthritis that had resisted conventional treatment. The medical establishment viewed these claims with profound skepticism, but the volume of positive reports was difficult to ignore entirely. Lakhovsky moved to New York in 1941, fleeing the Nazi occupation of France. He brought his devices and his research with him. Several American doctors began using the multiple-wave oscillator in their practices. Again, they reported improvements in conditions ranging from arthritis to cancer. But the AMA and FDA were already wary of electromagnetic healing devices after the Rife and Drown cases. Then, in 1942, Lakhovsky died after being struck by a car in Manhattan. The circumstances were suspicious. Witnesses reported the car accelerated toward him rather than attempting to brake. No driver was ever identified. Within weeks, his research notes were removed from his office. The multiple-wave oscillators in use by American physicians were confiscated by federal authorities on various pretexts and licensed medical devices. Unproven treatment methods, safety violations. By 1950, almost all of Lakhovsky's devices in America had been destroyed or were gathering dust in government storage. His publications remained available in technical libraries, but attempts to replicate his devices faced the now familiar obstacles. Modern researchers who try to rebuild multiple-wave oscillators according to his specifications report visits from regulatory officials asking pointed questions about their intended use. The seventh device ventured into territory even more controversial: the intersection of electromagnetism and gravity. Thomas Townsend Brown, an American physicist who worked for the Navy during World War II, discovered an unusual effect while experimenting with high-voltage capacitors in the 1920s. When he charged certain capacitor configurations to extremely high voltages, the capacitors appeared to produce a thrust in the direction of their positive pole movement toward the positive plate that seemed to violate known electrical principles. Brown called this effect electrogravitics and spent 4 decades investigating whether it represented a connection between electrical charge and gravitational fields. His experiments suggested that sufficiently strong electric fields could produce a force that acted similar to, but distinct from, both electrostatic attraction and electromagnetic radiation pressure. If true, this implied the existence of a coupling between electricity and gravity that Einstein's equations did not account for. The Navy took interest. Brown received classified contracts to continue his research. He demonstrated devices that appeared to move without any conventional propulsion, no exhaust, no moving parts, only high voltage applied to specially shaped electrodes. The movements were small and the force weak, but it was measurable and repeatable. Brown argued that with sufficient voltage and proper electrode geometry, the effect could be scaled up dramatically. Then his research was classified. For more than a decade, Brown worked on electrogravitics under military secrecy. When he tried to publish findings in the 1950s, much of his work was blocked by security reviews. What emerged in unclassified journals was fragmentary enough to show that something unusual was happening, but not enough to allow replication or theoretical understanding. By the 1960s, conventional physics had an explanation for Brown's observations that did not require new forces or gravitational coupling. The effect was attributed to ionic wind, charged particles created by the high voltage ionizing the air and creating thrust through conventional momentum transfer. This became the accepted explanation, and Brown's work was relegated to the category of interesting but misunderstood phenomena. However, Brown continued experimenting. He conducted tests in vacuum chambers where ionic wind could not exist. He reported that the effect persisted even without air to ionize, though at reduced magnitude. These results were published in obscure journals that mainstream physics ignored. When he died in 1985, his final experiments remained unpublished, his equipment distributed to private collectors or destroyed. The suppression pattern here is subtler than outright confiscation. Brown was not arrested, his books were not burned, his devices were not seized by federal agents. Instead, his work was classified, then explained away, then ignored. The military took what it wanted, academia dismissed what remained, and the question of whether electrogravitics represented a genuine coupling between electricity and gravity simply faded from scientific discourse without ever being definitively resolved. The eighth inventor studied energy fields from an unexpected angle-ancient architecture. Joe Parr, an engineer and physicist, became interested in pyramid energy in the 1970s. This was the era when popular books claimed pyramids possessed mysterious properties, preserving food, sharpening razor blades, concentrating cosmic energy. Parr approached the subject with scientific rigor, building instruments to detect whether any measurable fields existed around pyramid structures. His experimental design was careful. He constructed exact scale models of the Great Pyramid of Giza, oriented them to true north as the original was, and positioned sensitive electromagnetic detectors around them. He also built control shapes cubes, spheres, cones of equivalent mass and material to compare baseline readings. Over months of testing, Parr documented what he claimed was a real, measurable effect. The readings showed variations in electromagnetic and gravimetric measurements around the pyramid models that did not appear around the control shapes. More intriguingly, these variations seemed to correlate with lunar cycles and celestial alignments. During certain astronomical configurations, particularly alignments with stars in Orion's belt, which the Giza pyramids are theorized to mirror, the field measurements intensified dramatically. Parr's most controversial observation involved what he called an energy bubble that appeared to form around the pyramid during these peak periods. His instruments recorded a region of altered physical properties extending several feet from the pyramid's surface. Small objects placed in this zone during active periods exhibited unusual behavior-reduced mass measurements, altered electrical resistance, modified radioactive decay rates. These were extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence. He published his findings in fringe science journals. Mainstream physics publications refused to consider papers on pyramid energy. The response from academia was uniform dismissal. Pyramids were geometric shapes, nothing more. Any measurements Parr obtained must result from experimental error, environmental interference, or self-deception. No one proposed how experimental error could correlate precisely with lunar cycles, but that question was not addressed. Parr persisted for years, accumulating data and refining his detection methods. In the 1980s, he began receiving warnings. Anonymous letters advised him to cease his experiments. His laboratory was broken into twice. Equipment damaged, but nothing stolen. When he presented findings at alternative science conferences, individuals approached him afterward, suggesting his health might benefit from a change of research focus. By 1990, Parr had largely withdrawn from public discussion of his work. He continued measuring, documenting, testing, but stopped attempting to publish or present. His data exists in private archives, inaccessible to researchers who might wish to replicate his protocols. The question of whether ancient architectural forms can concentrate or modify subtle energy fields remains unanswered, not because the experiment is impossible to conduct, but because conducting it invites consequences few scientists are willing to risk. The ninth device investigated consciousness itself as a phenomenon that could be detected and measured. Cleve Backster, a polygraph expert who worked with the CIA, made an accidental discovery in 1966. He attached polygraph electrodes to a houseplant in his office, intending to measure how long it took water to travel from roots to leaves. What he observed instead changed his understanding of consciousness and sensing. When Backster thought about burning the plant's leaf with a match, the polygraph recording spiked dramatically before he had moved toward the plant, before he had struck the match. At the moment, the intention formed in his mind. He repeated the experiment. Again, the plant appeared to react to his harmful intention. When he merely pretended to intend harm, with no real commitment, the plant did not react. It seemed to distinguish between genuine intention and theatrical performance. Backster spent years refining this research, which he termed primary perception. He attached electrodes to various organisms, bacteria, eggs, plants, yogurt cultures. He designed automated protocols to eliminate human interference, randomly timed events that could harm one organism while recording electrical responses from others. The results suggested that living cells could detect threats to other living cells, even when separated by distance or shielding. The most disturbing experiments involved brine shrimp. Backster placed live brine shrimp in boiling water at randomized intervals determined by a computer. In another room, electrodes attached to bacterial cultures recorded electrical responses. The bacteria showed stress reactions at the precise moments the shrimp died, reactions that occurred before the shrimp hit the water, suggesting detection of the death event itself rather than any physical stimulus. The scientific community response was savage. Backster's credentials as a polygraph examiner were impeccable. He had trained CIA personnel in deception detection. But his plant experiments were dismissed as sloppy science, anthropomorphism, or outright fraud. Replication attempts produced mixed results. Some researchers reported similar findings. Others found no response at all. Backster argued that the effect was real but dependent on variables. Researchers did not control the experimenter's own psychological state. The electromagnetic environment, the synchronization between observer and observed. He proposed that primary perception operated through a mechanism science had not yet identified, something more fundamental than electromagnetic radiation or chemical signaling. This suggestion put his work beyond the reach of testable hypotheses in conventional frameworks. Funding for primary perception research evaporated. Universities declined to host such studies. Backster continued working privately until his death in 2013, but the question his experiments raised, whether consciousness is a detectable phenomenon that living organisms can sense across distance, remains unanswered, not because the experiment is impossible, but because investigating it marks a researcher as unserious, ending academic careers before they begin. The 10th and final device emerged at the intersection of electromagnetic theory and consciousness research. Konstantin Meyl, a German physicist and electrical engineer, proposed in the 1990s that Nikola Tesla's wireless power transmission experiments actually relied on a type of electromagnetic wave that Maxwell's equations did not fully describe. Meyl called these scalar waves or longitudinal electromagnetic waves, waves that propagated through the electric field itself rather than perpendicular electric and magnetic fields like standard radio waves. The distinction was technical but profound. Standard electromagnetic waves, the kind used for radio, television, and cell phones, consist of electric and magnetic fields oscillating perpendicular to the direction of propagation. Meyl argued that Tesla had discovered a different configuration where the electric field oscillated parallel to propagation. Creating a wave that behaved radically differently, could penetrate Faraday cages, transmit faster than light speed in the near field, and potentially carry information through mechanisms that conventional wireless communication could not use. Meyl built demonstration kits showing what he claimed was scalar wave transmission. The setup involved a Tesla coils, one transmitter, one receiver. Energy transfer occurred between them even when metal shielding was placed around the receiver, which should block all conventional electromagnetic transmission. He argued this proved the existence of longitudinal wave propagation distinct from standard Maxwell waves. The physics establishment rejected this interpretation. Critics argued that the demonstration simply showed near-field inductive coupling, a well-understood phenomenon that did not require new wave types. When Meyl published equations describing scalar wave propagation, reviewers found mathematical errors or argued the equations reduced to standard Maxwell theory under proper analysis. His work was labeled as misunderstanding established physics rather than discovering new phenomena. But Meyl's most controversial claim involved biological effects. He proposed that scalar waves were the mechanism by which DNA communicated within cells and between organisms. This connected to earlier work on biophotons, the discovery that living cells emit extremely weak light. Meyl argued that these biophotons were modulated by scalar waves carrying genetic information, and that this was the mechanism behind phenomena like Baxter's primary perception or even morphic resonance. Testing these claims required building scalar wave detection equipment that conventional instruments could not substitute for. Meyl designed specific detector configurations, but replicating them required understanding his theoretical framework, which most physicists considered fundamentally flawed. This created a deadlock. Mainstream scientists would not build the detectors because they rejected the theory, but without the detectors, the theory could not be experimentally confirmed or rejected. Meyl faced the subtlest form of suppression, not confiscation or legal action, but systematic exclusion from serious scientific discourse. His papers were rejected from major journals. Conference organizers declined his proposals to speak. Universities did not invite him for seminars. He taught at a small technical college in Germany, but his work remained isolated from mainstream research communities. The pattern across all 10 devices becomes clear when examined collectively. Each inventor claimed to detect or measure something that conventional instrumentation could not register. Kirlian photographed energy fields. Rife observed organisms at impossible magnifications. Reich accumulated orgone. Hieronymus detected eloptic radiation. Drowned photographed internal organs from a distance. Lakhovsky measured cellular frequencies. Brown coupled electricity to gravity. Parr detected pyramid energy fields. Backster measured plant consciousness. And Meyl transmitted scalar waves. All claimed access to hidden realities. The response pattern was equally consistent. Initial demonstrations drew interest and some support. Scientific establishment skepticism followed quickly. Then came active suppression confiscation, legal prosecution, or professional ostracism. In several cases, the inventors died under suspicious circumstances or shortly before major announcements. Research materials vanished. Devices were destroyed. Publications were burned or removed from archives. The question is not whether these devices actually worked as claimed. Rigorous scientific testing could resolve that question, yet such testing was systematically prevented. The pattern suggests that the threat was not fraud could be exposed and dismissed through demonstration of failure. The threat was the possibility that the devices might work, even partially, revealing aspects of physical reality that challenged fundamental assumptions about what can and cannot be measured. Consider the implications if even one of these devices had been accurately reporting real phenomena. If Kirlian coronas represented genuine biological energy fields, entire medical and biological frameworks would require revision. If Rife's frequencies could destroy pathogens, pharmaceutical approaches to infection would face fundamental challenges. If Reich's orgone existed, physics would need to account for energy forms not currently recognized. Each device threatened not just an industry or profession, but a comprehensive worldview about the nature of reality itself. The human cost is documented in premature deaths, destroyed careers, and abandoned research. Inventors who began with peer recognition ended in poverty and obscurity. Physicians who adopted these technologies lost their licenses. Researchers who attempted replication found themselves unemployable in academia. The message was clear: investigating certain territories of knowledge carried consequences that extended beyond professional disagreement into systematic destruction of livelihood and reputation. What united these suppressed technologies was their claim to perceive what official science declared imperceptible. They offered windows into hidden realities, energy fields, frequencies, dimensions, or information channels that standard instruments did not detect. Whether these claims were accurate or delusional could have been determined through careful, unbiased investigation. That such investigation was prevented, often violently, suggests that the possibility of these technologies working represented an unacceptable risk to established structures of knowledge and power. The pattern persists into the present day. Modern researchers who attempt to replicate these devices encounter obstacles their predecessors faced: denied funding, refused publication, professional isolation, sometimes direct interference. The specific mechanisms of suppression have evolved, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Certain territories of investigation are effectively closed, not through reasoned scientific conclusion, but through systematic prevention of inquiry. These 10 devices represent only the documented cases where enough evidence survived, confiscation and destruction to reconstruct the basic facts. How many other inventions vanished more completely, leaving only rumors and fragmentary references in obscure publications? How many inventors chose silence over persecution, taking their discoveries to the grave rather than facing the professional and personal destruction that publication would bring? The technologies claim to reveal hidden energies, unseen organisms, distant information, consciousness as a physical phenomenon, and dimensional aspects of reality that human senses cannot directly access. If even the possibility of these claims is threatening enough to justify burning books and imprisoning researchers, what does that suggest about the brittleness of consensus reality? What must those in power fear about expanded human perception, that they would expend such effort to prevent technologies of enhanced sensing from reaching public availability? The official explanations: protecting public health, preventing fraud, maintaining scientific rigor apply unevenly and selectively. Fraudulent medical devices appear regularly and are dealt with through fines and cease and desist orders, not book burnings and federal prosecution. Bad science is typically corrected through peer review and replication failure, not through confiscation of equipment and destruction of research notes. The level of response these 10 devices provoked suggests they represented something more dangerous than mere incompetence or deception. Perhaps the greatest suppression occurred not in laboratories or courtrooms, but in consciousness itself, when an entire category of investigation becomes professionally toxic. When students are taught that certain questions are not worth asking, when the very act of curiosity about hidden realities marks one as unserious or deluded, the external confiscations become unnecessary. The internalization of prohibition is the most effective suppression. It requires no enforcers, no book burnings, no legal action. It simply renders certain territories of knowledge unthinkable. These inventors shared a commitment to investigating what they perceived as genuine mysteries. They built instruments to make visible what was hidden, to measure what seemed unmeasurable, to bring into human perception realities that existed beyond our sensory limits. Whether their successes were real or imagined, the systematic effort to erase their work from history suggests that someone, somewhere, believed the possibility of success was too dangerous to allow. The documentation exists in fragments surviving patents, court records, personal correspondences, photographs of equipment that no longer exists. These remnants allow reconstruction of what was attempted and what was destroyed, but not what was discovered. The actual knowledge, the precise frequencies, the exact configurations, the refined techniques were lost when laboratories burned and inventors died. What remains is enough to know that something was there, but not enough to recover what was taken. If these stories intrigue you, consider subscribing to Investigator Squirrel. There are more buried inventions, more silenced voices, and more mysteries waiting to surface. What other technologies have been erased from history? Share your theories in the comments below.